Welcome to the History Maps podcast. So let us look at a vessel operating in the Arabian Sea, roughly 400 years ago.
Right.
We are talking about a Mughal merchant ship, which is known as a Ganj. And we really need to set the scene here because this is not a small, fragile wooden boat tossing in the waves.
Oh, definitely not. I mean, this is a leviathan of the pre-industrial world.
Exactly. It weighs in at perhaps 1,500 tons. So it is essentially the size of a modern multi-story office building, right? And it is constructed entirely of dense indigenous teak wood.
Yeah, and the hold of the ship, well, it is packed to the brim with hundreds of tons of black pepper, finely woven cotton textiles, and, raw silk.
And it is navigating these treacherous monsoon swells with a massive crew. It has a highly complex hierarchy of command, and the key thing here is that it is entirely Indian-built, Indian-owned, and Indian-operated.
That is a crucial point to start with.
Because, we often look at historical maps, and our eyes just naturally gravitate toward the land masses. We trace the borders of empires across terrestrial plains, we look at mountain passes, and we map out the flow of river valleys.
Right, the terrestrial bias.
Exactly. The blue parts of the map, the oceans, are frequently dismissed as just, negative space.
It is a really common cartographic bias. We tend to view the ocean as merely the empty void that separates the land masses where the actual history is supposedly taking place.
Yeah.
The sea is treated as a barrier rather than a bridge.
But when you actually dig into the historical records from the Indian subcontinent, that map completely inverts. The ocean is not a barrier at all. It is a highly trafficked, complex superhighway.
It really is.
So in this deep dive, which is a key part of our South Asian history series, we were exploring the deeply layered history of pre-contemporary Indian maritime activity. And specifically, we were looking at the millennia leading up to 1947.
And we have a vast and, frankly, very varied collection of sources to guide this exploration.
We really do. We are pulling from deep archaeological reports, from coastal excavations. We have precise translations of ancient administrative and technical texts like the Arthashastra and the Yukta-Kalpataru, and of course, extensive historical and economic analyses.
So the mission here is to fundamentally reframe how you understand the global economy.
Right.
Because the sources demonstrate that massive, highly organized, ocean-spanning trade networks were operating out of the Indian subcontinent for thousands of years before the first European galleons ever rounded the Cape of Good Hope.
The historical footprint is just undeniable. I mean, the Indian subcontinent functioned as the central hub of the Indian Ocean trade network.
And this status, it was not achieved by historical accident. It was the result of a very deliberate, systematic mastery of coastal geography.
Yeah, and advanced shipbuilding metallurgy and celestial navigation. It is a legacy that spans from the earliest Bronze Age settlements all the way through the classical empires and right into the early modern period.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start at the very beginning of the archaeological record.
Let us do it.
We are going back to roughly 3,000 to 1,500 BCE. This is the Harappan phase of the Indus Valley civilization.
Right, and for generations, the standard historical narrative basically taught that the Indus Valley was a purely landlocked, river-centric civilization. Like, they were farmers and city builders who just stayed put.
Yeah, that was the assumption. But the archaeological sources completely dismantled that idea. They were maritime powerhouses.
They really were.
They established a massive network of coastal settlements all along the modern-day state of Gujarat. We are looking at heavily fortified, economically active sites.
Places like Dholavira, Kuntasi, Bagatrav, Padri, and, above all others, Lothal.
Lothal fundamentally changes our understanding of Bronze Age engineering. This site dates back to roughly 2400 DCE, and it contains a structure that marine archaeologists identify as the world's earliest known dockyard.
Okay, we need to clearly understand the sheer physical scale of this construction because it is hard to picture.
It is. We are talking about a trapezoid reservoir that measures 214 meters in length by 36 meters in width.
Wait, 214 meters?
Yeah, exactly. To put that in perspective, that is the length of more than 2 modern soccer fields.
It is substantial.
And the walls enclosing this basin are constructed of continuous, dry masonry-baked bricks. The walls are 4 courses wide, meaning they are 4 layers of brick thick.
I assume to withstand the immense hydrostatic pressure of the water inside.
Precisely. And the basin reaches an extent, surviving depth of 3 meters, though sediment analysis indicates it was significantly deeper when it was fully operational.
I want to focus on the mechanics of this, because throwing around terms like dockyard can sometimes obscure the actual engineering reality. According to the archaeological reports, this was not just a big hole filled with water.
No, not at all.
It featured a very specific inlet channel and a spill channel that was fitted with a movable sluice gate. This was explicitly designed to manage the water flow from the nearby Sabarmati River. So if we think about how a modern canal lock system operates, where you trap water inside a basin so that ships can stay safely afloat regardless of the tidal conditions outside, is it accurate to think of Lothal as the Rotterdam of the Bronze Age?
What's fascinating here is that recent highly advanced geophysical surveys, along with sediment core analyses conducted in 2024, have corroborated that exact comparison.
Oh, really?
Yeah. For decades, there was this lingering academic debate over whether this massive brick structure was merely an oversized municipal water storage tank or maybe just a large irrigation reservoir.
Right, because finding a Bronze Age dockyard sounds almost too advanced.
Exactly. But the latest hydraulic modeling affirms its specific use as a highly sophisticated tidal dock. The structure was stratigraphically meaning through the layers of earth and sediment connected directly to the ancient active course of the Sabarmati River.
Let us break down exactly why a tidal dock is even necessary. Because if you are sailing a wooden ship into a river delta, you are entirely at the mercy of the tides.
Very much so.
When the tide goes out, the water vanishes, leaving vast expanses of deep mud. If your heavily loaded merchant ship gets caught in the receding tide, it drops into the mud, tips over, and the hull literally fractures under its own weight.
And that is exactly the problem they solved. The Harappans engineered this lock gate system to harness those violent tidal fluctuations.
How did it work, step by step?
So during high tide, the water from the Sabarmati River would rush into the inlet channel that fills the brick basin and brings the ships safely inside.
Okay.
Then, as the tide outside began to recede, the workers would drop the wooden sluice gate across the spill channel. This trapped the high water inside the massive brick reservoir.
Oh, I see. So the ships inside remained perfectly buoyant and level.
Exactly. It allowed laborers to easily load and unload heavy cargo onto the adjoining brick wharves, completely insulated from the chaotic tidal forces outside.
That is brilliant.
Furthermore, the system protected the vulnerable wooden vessels from the destructive seasonal river floods caused by the monsoon rains.
And the sources also point out a highly specific adaptation in how this dock was used over time. In its first operational stage, the inlet channel was massive.
Right. It was wide enough to allow ships measuring 18 to 20 meters long and 4 to 6 meters wide to pass through.
The inlet was actually so wide that two of these large ships could enter the basin side by side simultaneously. But as we move into the second stage of the dock's life, the archaeological record shows they deliberately narrowed that inlet channel.
Yeah, and in the second stage, only single, flat-bottomed ships could enter at a time.
Why did they do that?
That narrowing is a very clear indicator of environmental adaptation. The Sabarmati River Delta is historically prone to rapid siltation. The river constantly deposits heavy mud and sand, which slowly chokes the waterways.
So the river was getting shallower.
Precisely. As the river grew shallower over the centuries, the deep draft vessels used in the first stage could no longer safely navigate the estuary.
But they didn't just give up on the port?
No, the Harappans did not abandon it. They adapted their shipbuilding to favor shallower, flat-bottomed vessels that could glide over the silt, and they narrowed the dock's inlet to maintain higher water pressure inside the basin. This demonstrates a resilient, long-term maritime administration.
And the economic activity flowing through this dockyard was just staggering. Lothal was not a quiet fishing village. It was a roaring industrial emporium.
Absolutely. The excavations reveal massive manufacturing sectors. The Harappans were importing raw materials. They were manufacturing highly polished carnelian beads, working intricately with ivory and marine shells.
And operating large-scale copper smelting furnaces, right?
Yes, and we know definitively that these were export commodities because Harappan etched seals and their distinctive carnelian beads have been reliably excavated from the ruins of ancient Mesopotamian cities, like thousands of miles away.
The physical presence of those Harappan goods in Mesopotamia, I mean, that confirms a thriving transoceanic trade network.
It does. But beyond the goods, we also have archaeological evidence regarding the vessels themselves. The wood decays, of course, but the Harappans left behind models.
Right.
There is a precise terracotta model of a boat excavated from Lothal that clearly features a defined keel and a sharply curved hull.
Which are elements essential for cutting through ocean waves, as opposed to just flat river barges.
Exactly. And even more compelling is a highly detailed steatite seal from Mohenjo-Daro, dated between 3000 and 2500 BCE. It depicts a large vessel with a central mast, indicating the use of sails for wind propulsion and a very specific raised cabin structure.
There's a detail on that Mohenjo-Daro seal that absolutely hooked me.
Oh.
Yeah, alongside the mast and the hull, the seal clearly depicts avian figures birds. The ancient texts referred to these as Tishakaka birds.
Right, the navigation birds.
Because before the invention of the magnetic compass, being out on the open ocean, completely out of sight of land, is a terrifying prospect. If the sky clouds over and you lose the stars, you are sailing blind.
The Tishakaka birds were a profoundly ingenious biological navigation tool. The texts describe a very specific procedure.
How did it work?
Well, when mariners were navigating the open sea and became disoriented, or simply needed to verify the direction of the nearest coast, they would release one of these trained birds from the ship.
Okay.
The biological instinct of a bird released over open water is to immediately seek out the nearest solid landmass to rest. So the bird would fly high into the air, orient itself, and fly directly toward the shore.
And the sailors would just follow it.
Exactly. The sailors would observe the bird's flight path and steer the ship accordingly.
It is brilliant in its simplicity. And it proves that these sailors were not just engaging in coastal cabotage, meaning they were not just timidly hugging the shoreline, keeping the beach in sight at all times.
Right. If you need a bird to find the shore, you are in deep open water.
They were actively utilizing the seasonal monsoon winds to launch themselves across the Arabian Sea, aiming directly for the Persian Gulf and the markets of Mesopotamia.
That mastery of the open ocean sets the foundation for everything that follows in South Asian history. But as we move forward in the chronological record, we encounter a complex transition.
Right, around 1500 BCE.
Yes. Around 1500 BCE, the highly centralized urban systems of the Harappan civilization begin to decline. This is likely due to a combination of climate shifts, shifting river courses, and changing trade dynamics.
Which ushers in the Vedic period.
Exactly. The Vedic period eventually gives rise to the massive classical empires of the Iron Age.
This transition is documented in the earliest textual sources, particularly the Rig Veda. And when you read the hymns of the Rig Veda, you encounter numerous references to water and navigation.
You do. There are specific hymns, such as 1.97.7 and 8 and 1.25.7, that are dedicated to invoking the deity Varuna.
Pleading for safe passage across treacherous waters.
Yes. Furthermore, the specific Sanskrit word samudra, which translates to ocean or a vast confluence of water, appears 133 times throughout the text.
I have to ask, does the frequency of the word samudra mean that the Vedic people were launching massive ocean fleets, just like the Harappans?
This raises an important question about how we interpret ancient terminology. It is vital to understand the physical and economic context of the early Vedic period.
Okay, let's unpack that.
The society depicted in the early Vedas was fundamentally oriented around inland pastoralism, agriculture, and land-based chariot warfare. They were primarily situated in the vast plains of the northwest, focused on the Indus and Sarasvati river systems.
So they weren't necessarily on the coast.
Right. In that specific context, the term samudra frequently referred to large riverine transport. They were navigating the massive flood-swollen rivers of the Punjab rather than undertaking deep-sea oceanic voyages.
So they were managing boats, but primarily on inland, freshwater highways, moving agricultural surplus and local goods?
Precisely. However, the consistent presence of these nautical hymns strongly indicates that the foundational knowledge of watercraft, the understanding of currents, and the use of oars and rudimentary sails were never lost.
They preserved a deeply ingrained cultural memory of navigation.
Yeah. And as the Vedic society expanded eastward toward the Ganges Plain and eventually gave rise to massive, highly organized territorial empires, that latent maritime knowledge was completely reactivated and militarized.
Which brings us to a massive shift in how the sea is managed. We are moving into the era of the Mauryan Empire.
Yes, which dominated the subcontinent from roughly 322 to 185 BCE.
Here we see the state stepping in to formally organize and control maritime activity. And our primary source for this is the Arthashastra, written by Kautilya.
Kautilya was the chief advisor to Emperor Chandragupta Maurya.
And the Arthashastra is not a religious text or a collection of poetry. It is a brutally pragmatic, highly detailed manual on statecraft, economics, and military strategy.
Very pragmatic, and it explicitly details the creation of a dedicated naval branch of the government, known as the Navya.
The Arthashastra provides a really granular look
Yeah.
at Mauryan maritime bureaucracy.
Yeah.
I mean, the state did not just build ships, they categorized them and assigned specific administrative oversight.
Exactly. The text lists different classes of vessels based on their function and size. You have the Tari, which were small, agile boats used for local ferrying and river patrols.
Okay.
Then you have the Plava, which were significantly larger vessels meant for moving bulk cargo. And at the top of the hierarchy were the Mahanava.
The big ones?
Yes, these were massive ocean-going vessels that required a highly organized professional crew structure. Cotilia mandates that a Mahanava must be commanded by a Sasaka, or captain.
And they also had a Nyamaka. Right?
Yes, a Niyamaka, or a master steersman who understood celestial navigation and wind patterns.
So this is essentially the implementation of formal maritime law.
Mhm.
The state is defining what a ship is, who is allowed to pilot it, and how it must be operated.
It is highly regulated.
But what I find truly interesting about the Mauryan approach is how they handled the economics. The government built and owned these massive shipyards, but they did not just use the ships for the military.
No. The Arthashastra details a system where the state would lease these royal vessels out to private merchants and trading guilds.
The Mauryans understood that the state does not need to physically conduct the trade to profit from it. By leasing state-owned ships to private enterprises, they fostered a booming merchant class.
Right, and in return for the use of the ships and the protection of the state navy, the merchants were subjected to a rigorous system of customs duties and port taxes.
Every piece of cargo, loaded or unloaded, was weighed, cataloged, and taxed by state officials.
This revenue model is absolutely critical to understand because it created a self-sustaining loop. The massive wealth generated by taxing sea trade was poured directly back into funding the standing naval defense forces.
Which in turn protected the trade routes from pirates and rivals. It is essentially a sophisticated government ship chartering system operating over 2,000 years ago.
Exactly. And the Mauryans were aggressive about securing the geographical infrastructure needed to maximize the system.
Let's talk about that. Around 305 BCE, Emperor Chandragupta Maurya engaged in a major conflict with Seleucus I Nicator.
Who is a successor to Alexander the Great and controlled a massive empire to the west.
Right. But the treaty they eventually signed was not just about drawing land borders in the mountains. Chandragupta specifically negotiated to secure total control over highly lucrative western seaports.
Particularly Sappara and Farakacha in modern-day Gujarat.
Why were those specific ports so important?
Securing Barakacha, which was known to the Greeks as Barigaza, was a masterstroke of economic strategy. By holding those specific western ports, the Mauryan Empire gained absolute control over the primary shipping lanes that connected the Indian interior to the wealthy Hellenistic kingdoms of the Middle East.
And the Arab intermediaries operating in the Red Sea.
Precisely. They controlled the spigot through which Indian spices, gems, and textiles flowed to the Mediterranean.
And this strategy of projecting state power through maritime dominance, it outlasted the Mauryans. We see it explicitly weaponized as propaganda by later empires.
Oh, absolutely. Take the Satavahana dynasty, for example.
They control the vast eastern and central regions of the subcontinent from roughly 200 BCE to 220 CE.
Yes. And when we look at their material culture, specifically their numismatics, their coins, we see something striking.
They issued state currency that was explicitly stamped with highly detailed motifs of double-masted ships.
Currency is the ultimate tool of state communication in the ancient world. A coin touches the hands of merchants, soldiers, and foreign traders.
So when the Satavahana kings stamped large ocean-going ships onto their silver and lead coins, they were broadcasting a very deliberate message.
They were announcing to anyone who conducted business in their realm that the state possessed total naval supremacy, that their commercial fleets reached across the oceans, and that the wealth of the empire was intrinsically tied to the sea.
That commercial supremacy perfectly sets up the next major phase detailed in our sources, the Golden Age of Trade.
Yes, we have seen how early empires built the docks, formalized the bureaucracy, and secured the ports. Now we enter a period where massive private merchant guilds and powerful coastal kingdoms take that infrastructure and use it to project Indian culture, religion, and economic power all the way across Southeast Asia.
Let us focus first on the eastern coast of India, specifically the region of ancient Kalinga.
which corresponds to the modern-day state of Odisha.
Right. The historical mariners of Kalinga were known as the Satabas.
The Sahabas were among the most daring and successful navigators of the ancient world. Operating out of major Bay of Bengal ports like Palur and Menikapatna, they established deep, sustained trade networks with regions that were incredibly distant.
They did not just sail to neighboring kingdoms.
No, they launched massive expeditions to Indochina, the island of Java, and Bali.
We have to stop and think about the sheer logistics of a voyage to Bali in the first millennium. You cannot simply load a wooden ship with limitless supplies of fresh water and food.
You really cannot. They had to plot highly specific, multi-stage routes to ensure survival.
What did those routes look like?
The logistical constraints dictated the routes. A typical Sadhaba fleet would set sail from the Kalinga coast, utilizing the northeast monsoon winds.
Okay.
They would navigate south along the coastline of Burma, making their first major resupply stop at the Nicobar Islands. That first leg alone took roughly a month of open water sailing.
A month just to get to the first stop.
Yeah. And from the Nicobars, they would travel southeast, funneling down the Malay Peninsula, carefully navigating the treacherous and highly trafficked Strait of Malacca.
And once through the strait, the ocean opened up again, allowing them to reach the wealthy markets of Sumatra, Java, and eventually Bali.
The cultural memory of these massive Sadhaba expeditions is so deeply embedded in the region that it is still actively commemorated today.
Yes. Every year during the months of October and November, the modern state of Odisha holds a massive, vibrant festival called the Boida Bandana.
Which is also known as Bali Jatra, literally meaning the voyage to Bali.
Millions of people gather along the riverbanks to float beautifully decorated miniature boats made of banana stems and paper carrying small oil lamps. And the timing of the festival is not a coincidence, is it?
Not at all. It is tied directly to the ancient navigational calendar. October and November mark the retreat of the monsoon season,
Which historically provided the calm seas and optimal wind directions required to safely set sail for Southeast Asia.
It is a beautiful example of how meteorological realities shape long-lasting cultural traditions. But the Satabas were not the only major players during this era.
Right. As we move down to the southern regions of the Indian subcontinent, we see the emergence of entities that operate on a scale that defies traditional ancient economics.
We are talking about the rise of the mega guilds, most prominently the Ayavoli 500, the Managram, and the Nanadisi.
You know, when I read the source descriptions of the Ayavol 500, I had to double-check the time period. They do not sound like a local guild of blacksmiths or a neighborhood merchants association.
No, they sound exactly like a modern, aggressive multinational corporation.
Exactly. They managed wildly complex logistical supply chains across multiple kingdoms. They had massive treasuries, and they even employed their own private, heavily armed mercenary armies to protect their trade caravans and warehouses.
The comparison to a multinational corporation is highly accurate. These mega guilds were highly organized, deeply structured corporate entities.
They transcended local borders and operated across vast geographical distances.
They managed the procurement of raw materials, the financing of manufacturing, the overland transport of goods to the ports, and the ultimate maritime export.
And we know definitively that they established permanent, fortified trading settlements in foreign territories.
We have hard epigraphical evidence of this. There is a Tamil inscription explicitly tied to the Ayavol Guild, dated to the year 1088, that was discovered in Barus.
Which is located on the western coast of Sumatra in modern Indonesia.
Right.
So what does this all mean for the political structure of the time? I mean, if you have a corporate entity that possesses its own massive wealth, its own fortified bases abroad, and its own private military force, did the guilds start dictating state policy? Or did the kings maintain control over these megacorporations?
That dynamic is one of the most fascinating aspects of classical Indian political economy. The relationship between the state and the mega guilds was fundamentally symbiotic, though it occasionally blurred the lines of sovereignty.
How so?
Well, the guilds were so wealthy that they took on roles typically reserved for the state. They funded the construction of massive temple complexes, they built public water tanks and irrigation systems.
And in some port cities, they effectively managed the local municipal administration.
Exactly. The kings relied heavily on the immense wealth generated by the guilds through port duties, taxation, and direct loans.
In exchange, the guilds relied on the kings to maintain the overarching legal framework.
Right. to provide the heavy naval security needed to clear pirate strongholds, and to negotiate high-level diplomatic treaties with foreign empires to ensure favorable trading conditions.
And this powerful synergy between the corporate guilds and the state military apparatus facilitated one of the most profound cultural shifts in human history. Historians refer to this process as Southernization.
Southernization is the process by which a massive array of goods, technologies, and ideas spread outward from the southern Indian subcontinent and transformed the surrounding world. It is the precursor to later waves of globalization.
We are talking about the export of tangible, highly desired commodities like tropical spices, crystallized sugar, and finely woven cotton textiles.
But more importantly, the guilds were the vectors for highly advanced intellectual concepts.
They weren't just trading physical cargo, they were trading civilization software.
Exactly. As these Tamil and Kalingan merchants established permanent expatriate communities in places like the Burmese coast, the Thai peninsula, and the Indonesian archipelago, they brought their entire worldview with them.
They introduced advanced metallurgical techniques for working bronze and iron. They exported highly sophisticated mathematics and astronomical models.
And most visibly, they brought the profound religious and philosophical systems of Hinduism and Buddhism.
The physical evidence of this cultural export is staggering. You can see the direct architectural DNA of South Indian temple design in the massive structures of the Srivijaya Empire in Sumatra.
You see it in the breathtaking scale of the Angkor Wat complex in Cambodia and in the intricate carvings of Prambanan in Java.
This entire era represents a massive, largely peaceful integration of disparate cultures, all driven by the relentless engine of Indian Ocean commerce.
It was largely peaceful for centuries. The trade flowed, the merchants prospered, and the cultures mingled. But that era of peaceful corporate expansion shifts violently when we enter the period of the imperial Cholas,
who dominated the southern subcontinent from roughly 850 to 1279.
With the Cholas, we move away from trade secured by mutual agreement and into an era where trade routes were aggressively monopolized and expanded through sheer, terrifying naval military might.
The Chola dynasty represents the deployment of India's true blue water navy. The scale of Chola naval operations is practically unmatched in regional history.
Under the leadership of Emperor Raja I, who ruled from 985 to 1014, and his successor Rajendra I, who ruled from 1014 to 1044, the Cholas decided that simply participating in the trade network was not enough.
They wanted to control the physical choke points of the ocean.
Initially, they focused their naval power locally, launching massive amphibious invasions to conquer northern Sri Lanka, bringing the Maldives under their control, and occupying the Andaman and Nicobar Islands to secure their eastern flank.
And for a time, their relationship with the other major maritime superpower of the era, the Srivijaya Empire in maritime Southeast Asia, was highly diplomatic and mutually beneficial.
Srivijaya was a massive thalassocracy, a sea-based empire based in Sumatra that controlled the vital straits connecting the Indian Ocean to the Pacific.
In the early 11th century, relations were so good that the Srivijayan king Maravijaya Tungavarman actually sent massive funds to sponsor the construction of a beautiful Buddhist monastery.
Known as the Chudamani Vihara.
Right, directly within the Chola's primary port city of Nagapattinam. So you have the Sumatran king building a religious monument in the Indian king's port. It is the height of diplomatic friendship.
But something completely fractures that relationship.
By the year 1025, Emperor Rajendra I unleashes an unprecedented, devastating naval armada directly against the Srivijaya Empire.
The historical sources meticulously list the targets of this invasion. They struck Kadaram, Panay, Ilamaram, and nearly a dozen other heavily fortified port cities across the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the macroeconomic forces driving the globe at that exact moment.
You really cannot understand the Chola invasion of 1025 without looking at the global geopolitical triangle.
Right, on the far western end of the network, you had the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. They controlled the Red Sea and the access points to the wealthy Mediterranean markets.
And on the far eastern end, you had the Song dynasty in China. They were experiencing a massive economic boom and possessed a seemingly bottomless appetite for luxury goods, spices, and aromatics.
And sitting right in the geographical middle of this massive flow of wealth controlling the Indian Ocean, you have the Cholas and the Srivijaya Empire.
Precisely. And Srivijaya controlled the absolute most critical geographical choke points on Earth, the Strait of Malacca and the Sunda Strait.
Any merchant ship traveling between the Indian subcontinent and the markets of Song China, was physically forced to pass through waters controlled by the Srivijayan Navy.
And Srivijaya realized they held the keys to the toll booth. They began aggressively exploiting that geographical monopoly.
They started forcing the Chola merchant fleets and the mega guilds we talked about earlier to pay absolutely exorbitant tolls just to pass through the straits.
Furthermore, the Srivijayans were attempting to completely monopolize the final leg of the trade with Song China.
They were physically blockading the straits, preventing Tamil traders from sailing their own ships into Chinese ports, forcing the Indians to sell their goods to Srivijayan middlemen at depressed prices.
That economic strangulation was unacceptable to Rajendra I. The massive naval expedition of 1025 was not a war of territorial conquest.
The Cholas had no intention of permanently occupying and administrating the jungles of Sumatra.
No, this was a highly targeted strategic punitive strike. The goal was to smash the Srivijayan naval blockade, destroy their capacity to enforce tolls, secure a permanent trade monopoly for the Tamil guilds, and physically pry open the maritime Silk Route to China on Chola terms.
And it was staggeringly successful. The Chola Armada sacked the major port cities, plundered the treasuries, and actually captured the Srivijayan king, completely neutralizing their rival.
Okay, we need to pause and talk about the sheer mechanics of this invasion.
Yes, because traditional Chola history often focuses on their massive land armies and their beautiful stone temples.
Right.
How on earth does a kingdom transport the forces necessary to conquer an empire across the Bay of Bengal? We are talking about moving thousands of heavily armed infantry, siege equipment, massive stockpiles of food, and fresh water.
And according to some sources, actual war elephants.
The logistical complexity of moving elephants on wooden ships across an ocean is just mind-bending.
It requires a level of state organization and naval engineering that is difficult to overstate. You cannot simply put a war elephant on a standard merchant ship.
I would assume not.
The Chola naval architects had to design and construct massive, specialized, flat-bottom transport vessels reinforced specifically to bear the concentrated weight of large animals.
They had to design complex ramp systems for loading and unloading in turbulent surf.
The crews needed a flawless understanding of the monsoon wind patterns to time the departure perfectly, ensuring the fastest possible crossing to minimize the time the animals and troops spent at sea.
You would have specialized feeder ships carrying nothing but fresh water and forage for the animals, sailing alongside the troop transports, all protected by agile, heavily armed warships to fend off Srivijayan interceptors. It is a massive, highly synchronized amphibious operation.
It was a highly regimented, militarized chain of command, with the emperor acting as the supreme naval commander. The success of the 1025 expedition established a Chola hegemony that kept the Indian Ocean trade network in a state of relative open balance for several centuries.
It was a massive, free-flowing system where multiple empires and merchant guilds operated based on mutual economic benefit.
But the tides of history shift radically and permanently with the arrival of European powers.
The European entrance into the Indian Ocean forced all the indigenous coastal states to completely adapt their maritime strategies. Let us look at the situation on the western coast of India leading up to this clash.
For centuries, the massive port of Muziris had been the center of the spice trade. But around 1340, Muziris went into rapid decline.
Likely due to a massive, catastrophic flood that silted up the Periyar River, making the port inaccessible.
As Muziris died, the global traders shifted their operations slightly north, flocking to the city of Calicut.
The rulers of Calicut, who held the title of the Zamarin, seized this opportunity and engineered their city into the single greatest entrepot for the global spice trade.
The Zamarins were brilliant economic pragmatists. They understood that wealth flows to where it is secure and untaxed.
They implemented highly liberal social and economic policies. They guaranteed the physical security of foreign merchants, allowed complete religious freedom, and strictly promoted free, open trade with low, standardized customs duties.
This open-door policy attracted massive communities of Arab, Chinese, Jewish, and Indian merchants. Calicut transformed into this vibrant cosmopolitan hub where heavy shipments of black pepper from the Malabar interior were traded for Chinese silks, Arabian horses, and African gold.
It was a perfectly balanced open market system, but that entire system was violently shattered on a very specific date, May 20, 1498.
That is the day Vasco da Gama's Portuguese fleet dropped anchor off the coast of Calicut.
The arrival of the Portuguese represents a fundamental, violent disruption of the Indian Ocean paradigm.
By successfully navigating the treacherous waters around the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, The Portuguese bypassed the traditional overland Arab and Venetian intermediaries entirely.
They found a direct maritime route to the source of the spices.
But they did not sail all that way to politely participate in the open market the Zamorin had built. They came with a mandate to monopolize and control it entirely.
The Portuguese introduced a system of naval control known as the cartaz.
Yeah.
And we need to be very clear about how this worked.
Yes.
The Portuguese declared that any merchant ship, regardless of its nationality or origin, operating anywhere in the Indian Ocean, was legally required to purchase a naval pass a cartaz from Portuguese authorities.
And if a merchant ship was intercepted by a Portuguese galleon and could not produce this piece of paper, the Portuguese claimed the legal right to seize the entire cargo, burn the ship to the waterline, and frequently execute or mutilate the crew.
It represents a profound clash of fundamental maritime legal philosophies. The Portuguese operated on the rigid European doctrine of mare clausum, which translates to closed sea.
They firmly believed that their superior naval gunnery and their royal decrees granted them the literal ownership of the ocean, giving them the sovereign right to dictate exactly who was allowed to travel and trade on the water.
Meanwhile, the entire Indian Ocean network had been operating for millennia on the concept of mare liberum, the free sea.
Exactly. The traditional Asian consensus viewed the ocean as a boundless, unownable highway. The sea belonged to no single king, and trade was an open enterprise for anyone capable of building a ship.
The Portuguese shattered this consensus. They enforced their mare clausum monopoly through campaigns of extreme systemic violence.
They mounted heavy bronze cannons on their deep-draft galleons and utilized superior naval artillery to ruthlessly bombard coastal cities, terrifying local rulers into accepting their cartaz system.
You know, when you strip away the royal decrees and the European legal justifications, the cartaz system operated exactly like a mafia protection racket.
That is exactly what it was.
The Portuguese arrive in your waters and say, you must pay us a massive fee, and in exchange, we will protect you from us. If you refuse to pay our protection money, we will destroy your livelihood. But the local powers did not just roll over and accept this extortion.
Absolutely not. The resistance was fierce and protracted. The Zamorin of Calicut, watching his open market economy being destroyed, unleashed his own naval forces against the Portuguese.
These forces were commanded by a legendary lineage of Muslim admirals known as the Maracars. For roughly 80 years, spanning from 1520 to 1600, the Maracar admirals waged a relentless, highly effective guerrilla naval war against the Portuguese fleets.
They couldn't match the heavy cannons of the Portuguese galleons, so they changed the rules of engagement.
The Maracars utilized swarms of highly maneuverable, shallow-draft attack boats. They would hide in the complex networks of coastal estuaries and river mouths, wait for a heavy Portuguese galleon to sail past, and then swarm it from all sides.
Attacking swiftly and retreating before the heavy guns could be brought to bear, they were a massive bleeding thorn in the side of the European monopolists.
While this intense, localized naval guerrilla war was raging on the southern coast, a massive geopolitical shift was occurring in the north with the rise of the Mughal Empire.
The Mughals were an absolute continental superpower. They possessed near-limitless wealth, millions of subjects, and vast terrestrial armies equipped with heavy artillery and cavalry.
However, their approach to the maritime sphere was completely different from the Cholas or the Zamorins. The Mughals were focused almost entirely on commercial shipping, explicitly choosing not to build a standing, heavily armed blue water navy.
But they were still building massive ships, right?
According to the sources, the Mughal merchant fleets built in the shipyards of Gujarat and Bengal were structural marvels. They constructed enormous transport vessels known as the Ganj.
Which weighed between 700 and 1,500 tons.
They were essentially floating fortresses of commerce. And for complex riverine logistics along the Ganges and the Delta regions, they built large fleets of highly efficient, oar-powered galleys called jalbas.
The engineering capacity was certainly there. The Mughal shipwrights were master craftsmen capable of building some of the largest wooden vessels in the world. But this raises an obvious, glaring question regarding their strategic priorities.
Right. If the Mughal emperor has the wealth of an entire subcontinent at his disposal, and his shipyards are routinely cranking out massive 1,500-ton leviathans, why didn't he just order the construction of 200 heavily armed warships and physically crush the Portuguese blockades once and for all? Why tolerate the cartaz racket?
It comes down to how the Mughal state calculated value and threat. The Mughals viewed the sea almost exclusively through an economic lens, specifically as a mechanism to generate massive revenue via port customs duties.
Their primary strategic anxieties were entirely land-based. They were constantly focused on expanding their terrestrial borders, securing the volatile northwestern mountain passes, and suppressing internal rebellions.
The ocean, to them, was a distant frontier.
So they basically ran a cost-benefit analysis and decided fighting the Portuguese wasn't worth the expense.
Precisely. Initially, the Mughal administration found it vastly more pragmatic to simply tolerate the European licensing system. They even paid the extortionate Kartaz fees for their own massive royal pilgrim ships traveling to Mecca.
They accepted this humiliation because the Europeans, while violent at sea, ultimately brought massive quantities of New World silver into the Mughal economy, massively boosting the terrestrial commerce flowing through imperial ports like Surat.
It was a calculated, albeit passive, economic compromise.
But they weren't completely helpless on the water. When a regional maritime threat directly impacted their territorial integrity, the Mughals could project devastating naval power.
A prime example of Mughal naval capacity is Emperor Aurangzeb's campaign in the east. In the year 1665, the Mughal forces engaged in the massive Battle of Chittagong.
They deployed an overwhelming fleet of 288 warships, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers, to completely annihilate the Arakanese pirate fleets that had been ravaging the Bengal Delta.
When the terrestrial state decided to focus its vast resources on the water, they were unstoppable. But it was always a reactive measure, never a permanent maritime posture.
But while the mighty Mughals chose to passively tolerate European naval aggression on the western coast, another indigenous power rose up and decided to confront the Europeans directly.
We are moving into the era of the Maratha Empire, which recognized that survival against European encroachment required a dedicated, highly specialized naval force.
The foundation of this resistance was laid by Chhatrapati Shivaji in the 1650s. Shivaji was a visionary military strategist who realized that a terrestrial empire was acutely vulnerable if its coastline was undefended.
To protect the vital Konkan coast from European raids and blockades, he initiated a massive project of maritime fortification. He engineered and constructed incredibly formidable stone fortresses directly on the coast.
And sometimes on rocky islands out in the surf forts like the legendary Vijayadurg and Sindhudurg. Simultaneously, he commissioned the creation of a specialized Maratha fleet.
And this fleet was specifically designed to operate in the unique geography of the Konkan coast. They weren't trying to build massive, heavy galleons to fight the British in the middle of the deep ocean.
They built ships known as gurabs and galbets.
The architectural design of the fleet was perfectly tailored to their tactical doctrine. The gurabs were the heavier combat vessels of the Maratha Navy.
They were broad, shallow draft ships, typically featuring 2 or 3 masts, and they were heavily armed with broadside cannons, prow-mounted artillery, and reinforced hulls designed to ram enemy ships.
Operating alongside them were the galbets. These were much smaller, incredibly fast, and highly maneuverable boats powered by massive banks of oars and a single sail.
Shivaji built the foundation, but the Maratha Navy truly became a terrifying force to the Europeans under the command of a man named Kanhoji Anger.
Angry served as the Sarkol, the Grand Admiral of the Maratha fleet, from roughly 1698 to 1729. He is one of the most fascinating tactical minds in naval history.
Kanhoji Angry operated with an unprecedented level of strategic audacity. He established his heavily fortified naval headquarters at Colaba.
Crucially, he recognized the strategic value of Kundari Island, a fortified rock situated uncomfortably close to the massive British colonial stronghold of Bombay.
By taking control of Kandari, Angry essentially placed a heavily armed toll gate right on the doorstep of the British East India Company. From that vantage point, he monitored every ship entering or leaving the region.
And for over 3 decades, Angre maintained an absolutely undefeated record against the combined might of the European naval powers.
He demanded that all English, Dutch, and Portuguese vessels passing through Maratha territorial waters pay a specific maritime tax, known as the chaff.
If they refused to pay the tax, Angre's fleet would intercept them, overpower their escorts, and capture the deeply lucrative merchantmen.
The British were so infuriated by this that they launched massive, heavily armed naval expeditions specifically designed to kill him and destroy his fortresses. They sent their best armadas in 1717 and again in 1721.
Angre humiliated and repelled them both.
Let's unpack the tactics here. How does a regional commander continuously defeat the deep-pocketed, heavily armed global navies of the British and the Portuguese? The sources point to his absolute mastery of littoral warfare.
Littoral warfare is the art of fighting in the complex, shallow waters close to the shore. Angra possessed a profound tactical asymmetry.
He knew perfectly well that if he sailed his fleet into the deep open ocean and engaged in a traditional broadside-to-broadside artillery duel with massive European galleons, he would be obliterated.
The European ships carried far more heavy cannons, so he refused to fight on their terms.
He used the geography as his primary weapon.
Exactly. When a massive European warship approached, Anger would deploy his shallow draft-to-grabs and fast-rowing galbots. He would harass the European ships, firing from a distance, and deliberately retreat toward the shore.
The heavy, deep-draft European galleons, commanded by captains who did not fully understand the treacherous local underwater topography, would aggressively pursue him.
Anger would lure these massive ships directly into the shallow, rocky coastal waters of the Konkan region.
And suddenly, the European advantage vanishes. Their massive ships get caught in the treacherous tidal currents. The wind dies down and becalms their heavy sails. Or worst of all, their deep wooden keels smash directly into hidden sandbars or submerged reefs. They are trapped.
And the moment the European warship is immobilized in the shallows, the tactical environment instantly favors the Marathas.
Angry's shallow draft fleet, completely unimpeded by the sandbars, would rapidly close the distance.
Swarms of agile galbots would surround the trapped galleon from all sides, maneuvering into the blind spots where the heavy European cannons could not aim.
Maratha Marines would then swarm up the sides of the ship, initiating brutal, close-quarters, hand-to-hand combat on the decks, where European artillery was utterly useless. It was a perfectly executed strategy of environmental entrapment.
Now, if you read the official British East India Company records or traditional colonial histories from this era, they never refer to Kanhoji Angri as an admiral or a brilliant tactician.
They universally and venomously brand him as a pirate. They paint this picture of a lawless rogue terrorizing peaceful merchants.
But when you look at the primary sources regarding his actual operational mandate, that definition completely falls apart.
So I have to ask you, was Angry operating as a pirate or was something else entirely going on here?
The label of pirate was a highly deliberate, weaponized political strategy deployed by the European powers. You have to understand the legal framework the British, Portuguese, and Dutch were trying to impose.
They operated under the arrogant assumption that they, and they alone, possessed the international legal right to control the high seas, to dictate shipping lanes, and to levy taxes via their pass systems.
Therefore, any indigenous power that challenged their absolute monopoly or attempted to enforce their own sovereign taxation in their own territorial waters was automatically criminalized and labeled a pirate.
It is a massive double standard. When the British demand a fee under threat of violence, it is legal commerce. When Angry demands a fee under threat of violence, it is piracy.
Exactly, but the historical reality is that Kanhoji Angre was not a rogue actor acting for personal plunder. He was the formally appointed Sarkar, the official Grand Admiral of the sovereign Maratha state.
He operated under the direct authority of his government. The shot he extracted was not pirate booty. It was a legitimate state tax levied to fund the defense of the realm.
He was enforcing the legitimate territorial defense policies of his government against hostile, armed foreign corporate entities. He was violently asserting indigenous sovereignty over indigenous waters.
Ultimately, the tragic end of the Maratha Navy was not brought about by some grand European naval victory at sea. It was destroyed from the inside out by internal political fractures.
After Kanhoji Angre's death, bitter succession feuds erupted among his heirs, which catastrophically weakened the fleet's unity and operational cohesion.
This internal chaos culminated in a devastating joint attack in 1756. The British East India Company allied themselves with the Peshwas, who were the central Maratha political authority at the time, and were locked in a power struggle with the Angra family.
This combined force attacked the primary naval base at Vijay Durg, captured the current commander Tulaji Angre, and burned the fleet.
That singular event effectively ended organized indigenous blue water sea power on the western coast, violently clearing the path for 2 centuries of total British colonial dominance.
It serves as a stark, historical reminder that naval power is ultimately an extension of state cohesion. You can possess the most tactically brilliant fleet, the bravest commanders, and the most advanced ships. But a navy requires immense continuous logistical and financial support.
Without a unified, stable political structure on land to maintain those supply lines and project unified authority, the fleet will eventually succumb to superior organization.
Before we wrap up this massive timeline, it is absolutely crucial to spend some time understanding the physical technology, the actual science of the seas.
What were the specific engineering elements that allowed all of these historical eras, from the Harappan tidal docks to the massive Mauryan merchant fleets and the Maratha coastal defenders, to physically navigate and survive the crushing forces of the ocean?
The sources provide deep details on traditional shipbuilding texts. One of the most prominent is a highly technical 11th century manual called the Yuktikalpataru, written by King Boja of the Paramara dynasty in Malwa.
This is not a theoretical text. It is an engineering manual. It meticulously categorizes various classes of ships based on their dimensions and functions, including a very specific class called the Agramandira, which was designated exclusively for naval warfare.
The Yuktikalpataru is a window into a deeply systematized, highly advanced knowledge of maritime engineering. The categorization is incredibly precise.
When describing the Agramandira, the text explicitly details that the primary cabins and command structures must be located far forward, towards the prow of the ship.
The text notes that this specific weight distribution and structural elevation made it uniquely suitable for intense naval combat, providing the Marine archers and boarding troops with a highly stable, elevated platform from which to fire down upon the decks of enemy vessels.
The construction techniques themselves are incredibly unique, perfectly adapted to the violent realities of the Indian Ocean environment. First, let us look at the primary material.
Wood.
They predominantly utilized indigenous teak wood, scientifically known as Tectona grandis. They sourced this massive timber from the deep forests of Gujarat and the Malabar coast.
But it is how they assembled this wood that is truly fascinating. If you look at European shipbuilding in the same era, they relied heavily on driving thick iron nails through oak planks to hold the hull together.
The Indian shipwrights completely rejected iron nails for the hull. Instead, they utilized the stitched plank method. They literally drilled holes in the massive wooden planks and sewed the entire ship together using miles of highly durable rope made from core, which is processed coconut fiber.
At first glance, to a modern observer, the idea of tying a massive ship together with coconut rope sounds incredibly fragile. But the physics behind the stitched plank method are absolutely brilliant and perfectly suited to the specific environment.
An iron nail is completely rigid, and in the highly saline environment of the ocean, it inevitably rusts, swells, and eventually breaks. Furthermore, when a massive, rigid, nail-fastened European hull slams into a 50-foot monsoon swell, the immense kinetic energy of the wave transfers directly into those rigid joints.
The wood splinters, the nails pop out, and the hull fractures.
But a stitched hull behaves entirely differently.
Exactly. A hull stitched together with core rope possesses a critical degree of structural flexibility. It acts almost like a suspension bridge. When the ship hits a massive wave, the stitched joints flex and absorb the kinetic energy rather than fighting it.
The hull bends with the ocean instead of breaking against it. Additionally, they utilized complex edge joining techniques, fitting the planks together like puzzle pieces, and sealed the gaps with highly specific, naturally derived resin adhesives.
When the wood hit the water, it swelled, instantly pulling the core ropes incredibly tight and creating a perfectly watertight yet flexible seal.
The sources also highlight a major sociological difference in how these ships were operated, specifically regarding the galleys. When we think of classical Mediterranean galleys, like the massive Roman quinqueremes or the later European galleys, we picture hundreds of chained slaves rowing enormous heavy sweeps under the threat of a whip.
But the Indian sources point to a completely different operational philosophy. The principle of one oar, one man. They did not utilize chained slave labor on their ships.
The rejection of naval slave labor fundamentally altered the architecture of the ships. Because they relied on highly trained, professional free mariners, the ships were designed for individual efficiency rather than brute synchronized force.
Each oarsman was responsible for a single, highly maneuverable paddle. Furthermore, the design of the hull often placed these oarsmen seated safely below the gunwale line, the upper edge of the ship's side.
This architectural choice protected the rowers from incoming enemy arrows and projectiles, while completely clearing the upper deck, allowing the professional fighting crew to move rapidly and freely during combat without tripping over massive wooden rowing sweeps.
And their navigation systems were equally sophisticated. We already discussed the ancient Dishakaka birds, but by the classical era, they were applying highly advanced mathematics to the ocean.
They actively utilized the complex astronomical calculations of the genius mathematician Aryabhata to predict celestial movements for deep water navigation. They utilized specific physical instruments.
They had the yantra, a mechanical device used for varied astronomical observations, and the kamal. The kamal is fascinating. It was a simple but brilliant device consisting of a rectangular piece of wood and a knotted cord, specifically used to measure the altitude of celestial bodies, primarily the North Star, to accurately determine the ship's latitude while out on the open water.
The level of indigenous innovation was vast, but they were also incredibly open to conceptual experimentation. There is a mention in the later historical sources of an ancient Sanskrit technical text called the Aptayana.
This text provides a theoretical breakdown of 4 distinct methods for physically propelling a ship through the water. 3 of the methods are entirely standard and expected: using poles to push off the riverbed, using traditional oars, and utilizing large paddle wheels with oars attached to the circumference.
But the fourth method described is wildly ahead of its time. The text describes a mechanism known as Brahma Jalanirgama, which translates to a wooden screw mechanism extending out of the water to generate forward propulsion.
Wait, are you saying they invented the modern boat propeller centuries before the Industrial Revolution?
This raises an important question regarding how we interpret ancient theoretical engineering. We must be careful not to overstate the physical reality based on a textual description. We do not have any concrete archaeological evidence to suggest that a fully functional, highly efficient screw propeller was actively used on major fleets.
However, the sheer conceptual description, the theoretical understanding that a helical screw mechanism could displace water to generate forward thrust, is absolutely remarkable.
It points to a highly vibrant, intellectually restless engineering culture. Indian maritime technology was never stagnant. It was deeply rooted in incredibly strong indigenous foundations, but it consistently absorbed and adapted useful foreign influences, refining its capabilities over millennia.
But the core indigenous strength, particularly the mastery of teak wood, cannot be overstated. Teak is a biological marvel. It produces a dense, natural oil that makes the wood incredibly resistant to water saturation, immune to fungal rot, and highly repellent to wood-boring marine termites.
An Indian-built, stitched teak ship was orders of magnitude more durable than a European oak ship constructed in the same era. There are numerous historical records from the colonial period noting that massive teak merchantmen remained fully seaworthy for over 80 years of continuous brutal service, while the heavy European oak galleons often rotted out and fell apart in a mere fraction of that time.
It was this superior command of materials, combined with flexible engineering and deep astronomical knowledge, that allowed these vessels to carry the wealth of an empire across the treacherous, storm-tossed monsoon routes year after year, century after century.
If we step back and consider the entire massive scope of what we have discussed today, starting from the incredibly precise tidal mud docks of Lothal in the Bronze Age, moving through the sophisticated corporate supply chains of the mega guilds, examining the terrifying logistical power of the Chola amphibious armadas, and witnessing the brilliant coastal defense strategies of the Maratha Navy under Kanhoji Angra, we see a continuous, unbroken 4,000-year legacy of profound maritime engagement.
The Indian subcontinent was never an isolated, passive landmass waiting to be discovered by European explorers. It was the vibrant, aggressive, beating heart of a massively interconnected oceanic world.
And I want to leave you with a final, broader thought to consider as we close this deep dive. When the modern nation of India finally gained its independence in 1947, and the newly formed government began the arduous process of rebuilding a modern sovereign navy, they were not starting from scratch.
They were not importing a foreign concept.
They were reawakening a 4,000-year-old, deeply ingrained cultural instinct. If you look at a satellite map of the Indian Ocean today, if you trace the glowing lines of modern container ships, the deep-sea oil routes, and the massive economic hubs that drive our world, you will see something profound.
Those modern shipping lanes are almost exactly the same ancient monsoon routes charted by the Harappans, navigated by the Sadhavas, and commanded by the Cholas. The ancient arteries of the sea continue to perfectly shape the modern global economy. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.